Hi guys, it's Melissa. I am going to be going over my behavioral change project, which I did it on non-compliance. Johnny is a 5-year-old boy who I worked with who is diagnosed with autism. He was referred to us to address tantrum behaviors and verbal behavior deficits. Johnny currently has 4 hours of ABA services in which we do it in his home. Spanish is the primary language spoken in the home. However, all of our interventions are done in English with just parent translation for them if they had any questions or concerns about the intervention that we implemented. So for my behavioral change project, non-compliance was defined as completion of the specified demand more than 5 seconds after the presentation of the initial command. Some of the behaviors that Johnny would display included throwing items at the interventionist, shouting, screaming, crying, hitting with a closed hand, and sometimes elopement. This typically occurred when novel instructions were delivered, and especially if they were vocal programs. Anytime a vocal instruction was delivered, so it could be vocal imitation, for example, if we would say this, he usually would engage in these non-compliant behaviors because we were pushing for clearer approximations, so he would display more of those frustrations and display those non-compliant behaviors. A latency recording system was used to access the latency to compliance following the initial command. A latency measure was included because a lot of Johnny's target skills are vocal programs, so I wanted to make sure that I was using latency recording system just to see if by implementing our intervention we could see a decrease in these latency durations. As well as using a latency recording system, I also implemented percent compliance measures just to see as well if by implementing our intervention, if the percent compliance would increase. So the two measurement systems I used were latency to see if we would see a decrease in the latency time, and as well as percent compliance to see if we would see an increase in his percent compliance. Latency and percent compliance were documented on the latency sheet. Latency was measured by starting the timer if Johnny did not comply within the demand within those 5 seconds. So if we say this, and Johnny started to engage in his non-compliant behavior and did not respond within those 5 seconds, the behavior interventionist would start the time, and since it's a vocal program, we can't necessarily force the words out of his mouth, so we would have to wait until he calmed down and then represent the instruction, say this, and once he complied with the instruction, we would stop the timer, and then the interventionist would document the time that it took for him to comply. IOA data was taken across 25% of the interventions, and the IOA was 90% for latency and 100% for percent compliance. The case manager also collected treatment fidelity just to make sure that the behavior interventionist was doing the procedure correctly, and the treatment fidelity ended up being 100%, so that was good. The procedure that we used was a single subject reversal AB design. Initial baseline data was taken for 5 sessions, and then treatment data was collected for 7 sessions. Return to baseline condition and treatment conditions were both taken for 5 sessions, so 10 sessions total there. During the baseline phase, Johnny's behavioral therapist delivered at least 10 instructions within Johnny's current programs in the home setting. She measured the latency to compliance across the demands as well as the percentage of compliance. During the baseline phase, there was no prompting, no reinforcement was delivered during baseline. If Johnny displayed an episode of non-compliance within the 5 seconds, the behavior technician just removed the demand and moved on to the next demand. During the intervention phase, the behavior technician implemented a differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. The behaviors of non-compliance were put on extinction, and praise and access to breaks were taught as the incompatible behaviors. So this is just to reiterate, if we delivered the instructions, say this, and Johnny complied with instruction, then we would give him loud praise and then also allow him to go have a 5-minute break from working on that vocal program. And then we would present another instruction, say this. He responds, no non-compliant behaviors. Again, he gets praise, he gets access to a 5-minute break. But then on the third one, if we say this, it's a new instruction, he engages in the non-compliant behaviors and does not respond within those 5 seconds, we would start the time. Once he complies, press stop on the timer and then document the latency of responding. And then also we would document the percent compliance, which would be a minus because he did not comply. The results demonstrated that during baseline, Johnny's latency of responding averaged 4.7 minutes. During the treatment phase, Johnny's latency of responding to demands decreased to an average latency of responding of 36 seconds. During the return to baseline, the average latency of responding was 1.6 minutes. Reintroducing the treatment phase, the average latency dropped to 0. So, yay! During the baseline phase for the percent compliance, the average was 10% compliance. During introduction of the DRI treatment phase, Johnny's percent compliance increased to an average of 92%. During the return to baseline phase, Johnny's average percent compliance was 76%, which was still a lot higher than the 10% that we had initially in the first baseline. And then returning back to the DRI intervention, Johnny's percent of compliance increased to 96% average compliance to task. So, and here's some graphs I'll show you. Here's the graph for percent compliance. So that looks good. And then here's the graph for the latency. Now, some of the limitations that I found while doing this was just being in the home. There's a lot of distractions. There's also the barrier of parents not being on board. So I explained what we were doing and I tried to get them on board to be doing the same thing outside of the session, but that wasn't always the case. I wish I would have had more time to do maintenance phase just to see if the skills were being maintained, as well as generalizing, especially with the parents. So that was my project, and I think that I got good results, and I actually had really fun doing this. So I can't wait to hear everybody else's behavioral change projects. Thank you.